This teaching module is called Changing Views on Sound Macroeconomics. We'll be looking at how the profession, how establishment economics has changed over time its views on what constitutes sound macroeconomics. When we say sound macroeconomics, we mean economic policy, macroeconomic policy, which is sustainable or correct or proper or prudent. So sound macroeconomics. What is sound macroeconomics? So I've divided it into three periods. We can look at macroeconomic thinking and break it down into three historical periods. Starting with the classical liberal period of history, 1870 to 1914, we can call that period the period of balanced budgets. Second period, post-World War II through the 2008-2009 financial crisis, we can call that managing debt over the business cycle. And then today, starting with the massive interventions after the housing boom and bust, 2008 and 2009, through the interventions today in the COVID period, we can call that debt doesn't matter. So there's three distinct views, changing views of macroeconomic policy making over time. And classical liberals like myself find that we're going from sound macro to less and less sound macro in a classical sense. So the first period is, again, the classical liberal period. And the institutions there were free trade, the gold standard, and a small state, focusing on negative rights rule of law or commercial law. And because nations were on the gold standard, they had to balance their budgets. Government spending more or less equaled government taxes, because you couldn't print money and cover budget deficits. Central bank couldn't print money and cover the budget deficits because you had to exchange paper for gold and gold for paper. So you had institutional structures in place that prevented the running up of debt. Then Keynesian economics came to the fore during the 1930s. Then you had World War II, and then came to the fore through today after World War II. So that's the period of Keynesian economics, where you manage the debt over the business cycle. During the downward portion of the business cycle, you spend more than you tax, you get government stimulus, and then you lower the interest rate in order to get investment. So you do that during the downward portion of the business cycle, then you tighten up the money supply or taper off the increase in the money supply, and then run budget surpluses in order to pay down the debt that was created during the downward portion of the business cycle, deficit spending. So under Keynesian economics, we're supposed to manage the debt over the business cycle. But as it turned out over history is that nations rarely ran a budget surplus during the economic growth period. So you just ended up running larger and larger deficits. And the central bank in the United States was created in 1914. So the post-World War II period of Keynesian economics includes the central bank in the United States and monetary easing. So we know, so under what I'll call the old macroeconomics, prior to the financial crisis, old macroeconomics, it's sound policy when national income is growing greater than the national debt. So if national income is growing greater than the national debt growth, then that's sound macroeconomic policy. So prior to the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, economic growth was 3% a year. And then the national debt in the United States, I'm talking about, is growing at 2% a year. So you have sound macroeconomic policy when the national income is growing greater than the national debt. And that was the case up until the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and all the massive bailouts that occurred then. So, for example, in the Eurozone, they created the euro, the common European Union currency, the euro, in 1999 through 2001. And the way that a nation could get into the Eurozone is if their national debt to national income was less than or equal to 60%. So, for example, in the United States today, after all of the bailouts of the COVID period, the national debt today, right now, today, April 2021, the national debt is 28 trillion. And the national income, let's say, is about 21 trillion. So you'll see that the national debt is much greater than the national income, about 120%. The debt is about 120% of national income. So the United States wouldn't even have been let into the Eurozone because of this unsound macroeconomic policies where the accumulated debt is greater than 100% of national income. So here's the business cycle. You have the boom period, and then the bust period, and then the boom period, and then the bust period. During the bust period is when you're supposed to do macroeconomic interventions. Lower the interest rate to encourage investment, and increase in government spending to create fiscal stimulus. And then during the downward portion, you take those actions, and then the upward portion, you raise the interest rate and create budget surpluses to pay back the debt that's created during the downward portion of the business cycle. And we know from Mankew's economists agree that national debt has adverse effects on the economy, and that the budget should be balanced over the business cycle. We know that from Mankew's economists agree. So here's economists agree. If the federal budget is to be balanced, it should be done over the business cycle rather than yearly. So fiscal conservatives like myself, we would prefer a balanced budget agreement, meaning that the budget should be balanced every year. The national budget should be balanced every year, but Keynesian economists determined that it should be balanced over the business cycle. But we've learned that doesn't happen, that due to Sol's rule, that the incentive is for politicians to just spend more today and pass it off till tomorrow. So the old sound macro policy wasn't working because the budget was never balanced, or rarely balanced. The incentives aren't in place to balance the budget. And then 85% of economists agree with that. And then 83% of economists agree that a large federal budget deficit has an adverse effect on the economy. Yet, as stated, we've now have 28 trillion in debt, and only a $21 trillion economy. So the old macro policy was not working. So the old macroeconomic policy wasn't working. So then you had the huge interventions from the after the 2008-2009 financial crisis. Both Team Blue and Team Red used monetary easing and fiscal stimulus to address the housing boom and bust during the downward portion of the business cycle. And the end result of that today, the end result of the historical practice today, is that there's a new type of determination of sound macroeconomic policy, which is that debt doesn't matter. So, and this was expressed in the Economist Magazine 2021. So if it's in the Economist, then it's conventional wisdom in the economic sector, economic profession. And this idea that debt doesn't matter is akin to modern monetary theory, where you can print as much money as you want because to cover the debt, because debt doesn't matter. And of course, this is you would think unethical or immoral, because that debt does matter, because that's debt that's passed on to those yet voting and yet even born. So current expenditures today for politicians to get votes today, that debt is then passed on to those yet voting and yet born. So that's this is called economic science, which is removed from ethical considerations. And so under the new sound macroeconomic policy vision, sound policy is when national income is greater than the national debt borrowing rate. So because we had all of these great macroeconomic interventions after the housing boom and bust, the new normal of economic growth has been 2% economic growth. We know from Ann Kreuger's paper, 1974, Political Economy of the Rent-Seeking Society, that when you have interventions, eventually this market stops working. And that's exemplified by the fact that now the new normal of national income, again, prior to the COVID lockdown, was 2% since the financial crisis, not 3% as it was before all the interventions of the financial crisis. And because now we've had 12 years of easy money since the interventions, luckily, now the nation state is borrowing at 1.5% interest. So luckily, under the new sound macroeconomic policy, everything's okay. That's the Whig theory of history. What is, should be. So you're getting new, lower than historic levels of economic growth, and then lower than historic borrowing rates for the nation state. Prior to all the easy money of the last 12 years since the housing crisis, the nation state would borrow at about 3%. But now, due to the easy money and continued easy money and continuing easy money, the nation state is now borrowing at 1.5%. Luckily, debt doesn't matter and economic growth is lower. So now the whole idea of sound macro has changed, that it's not important to balance your budget or to have national income greater than debt growth, just as long as the nation state is borrowing at less than economic growth. So let's take a look at the Economist Magazine article and then the Government Accountability Report that shows why this new macro, this Government Accountability Report is a critique of the new macro. In other words, not all economists agree that the new macro is sound. So this is the Economist Magazine article, which now codifies the fact that as long as this is from March 2021, as long as, in this article, the point of this article is that as long as the nation state borrowing rate is less than the rate of economic growth, then debt doesn't matter. So it's been codified. The new macro has been codified in the Economist magazine. And here's the General Accountability Office report of March 23, 2021 on the nation's fiscal health. Focus needed on achieving long-term fiscal sustainability. So the GAO determines that the new macro is not fiscally sustainable or not sound. The COVID pandemic, even before that, the federal government's long-term fiscal path was unsustainable because debt was growing faster than the economy. As we stated, that's the old macro, but now many economists are conveniently using the new macro to justify what the political sphere is doing. So you'll see that by 2020, debt was 100% of GDP, again, much greater than the 60% of GDP that was required to be accepted into the European Euro Union. And then you'll see here's the debt, the growth of the debt and through the pandemic, and then as projected out into the future. And you'll see that here we are today, and you'll see that it's expected by 2050 that that national debt will be almost 250% of the economy, much greater than the 60% that's deemed sustainable. And it only was greater than 60% during World War II, and then with the Great Recession after the housing boom and bust. So in practice, only during war and then the overreaction to the Great Recession are we now on this new unsustainable fiscal path. And the reason for that is because in the long-term, spending on federal health care programs and Social Security drive most of the increase in federal non-interest spending as a share of GDP. In other words, economic principle number one, the welfare state is unsustainable. We mentioned the interventions after the housing boom and bust. So in 2008 to 2010, both Team Red and Team Blue did 10% of GDP in fiscal stimulus. And that at the time was the greatest peacetime fiscal stimulus. And in the last year alone, both Team Red and Team Blue have done 25% of GDP in fiscal stimulus. The previous administration did 4 trillion, so you have the pandemic and you never let a good crisis go to waste. So lock down the economy and then use fiscal stimulus and easy money to channel funds to your political constituencies. So Team Red channels funds to oil and gas, and Team Blue channels funds to blue states and labor unions and public schools. So the previous administration did 4 trillion in COVID relief, and the current administration has done 2 trillion in COVID relief with a projected, they're now determining how much the new fiscal stimulus will be. Even though the fiscal stimulus of the previous administration hasn't even been dispersed yet. So, and the economy is already, the amount dispersed is already greater than income per person. In other words, the fiscal stimulus is greater than national income already. So Larry Summers, who has been a consultant to Team Blue for many years, he says that any onward relief will be the worst macroeconomic policy he's seen in 40 years. In other words, any additional macroeconomic expansion will only be inflationary. It won't have any effect on the real economy. And this is coming from a stalwart of Keynesian economics, who's now saying, wait a minute, this new macro is not really sound. This coming from Larry Summers. So then debt doesn't matter. Well, the New York Federal Reserve disagrees. They have a March 2021 report that says that monetary stimulus or easy money is regressive policy. So again, the idea of increasing the money supply is that it would have a positive effect on job creation. But now, for the first time in an important paper, the Fed is now acknowledging that easy money also has asset market implications. In other words, some of the easy money goes towards job creation, but more of the money, especially during the lockdown, goes to asset market bubbles, meaning you're getting real estate market bubble and stock market bubbles due to the easy money that's being printed to pay for the debt and is channeling to try to encourage investment. But because the economy is closed, that money is not able to be channeled to sound investment. It's just creating asset market bubbles. So asset market bubbles help those with more disposable income because only those with more disposable income can afford to invest in asset markets. So the easy money helps those with more disposable income to a greater degree than it helps those worse off with less disposable income, because the asset market bubbles are greater than the job creation. And then all of the money that's being created creates asset market bubbles. And then now Larry Summers is worried about the inflation that all this easy money will allow to occur. So we can look at the Federal Reserve March 2021 report, and then the monetary money supply increases of the last year. Okay, here's the Federal Reserve report, the January 2021. We conclude that there is little reason to think that accommodative monetary policy, or easy money, plays a significant role in reducing racial inequities in the way often discussed. On the contrary, it may well accentuate inequalities for extended periods. In other words, racial minorities, or in the United States, we have a majority minority, people of color tend to have less disposable income. So the easy money helps those with more disposable income and hurts those with less disposable income. So in other words, we conclude that there is little reason to think that accommodative policy, monetary policy, plays a significant role in reducing racial inequities. In fact, it exacerbates racial inequities. So this is from the Federal Reserve Bank, October 2019 through February 2021. I just pulled this up yesterday, April 5. So you'll see the Austrian school uses near money. In other words, not time deposits, but things that are near money to represent the money supply. And again, we just learned through the Fed that an increase in the money supply creates inequality. Yet you'll see that the money supply in October 2019 was $3.9 billion or $3 trillion in 2019, yet it's $18 trillion in February 2021. So the money supply has gone up 500% in 2 years. So that's why Larry Summers is worried about inflation and the Fed is worried about increasing inequality due to easy money. But you need that easy money under the new macro thinking in order for the state to be able to borrow at low rates of interest. So with the extraordinary interventions under the new macroeconomic thinking, we now have, as stated, $28 trillion in national debt. 330 million people in the United States. So in other words, every single person in the United States owes the federal government $90,000. And you don't see that that debt is being passed on generation after generation. That leads to reduced economic well-being, because economists agree that debt is adverse for the economy. But that's the liabilities only on budget, the official record of US government debt. There's also unfunded liabilities, and this is again only at the federal level. The unfunded liabilities per person in the United States are approaching $1 million. So a person born in the United States today would owe the US government $1 million or have their standards of living being reduced. However, you don't see these things. And this is what Bastiat calls what is seen and what is unseen. Frederick Bastiat, who was a French classical liberal, argued that you see the results of government policy, but you don't see the costs of government policy. So you don't see that the debt is being passed on generation after generation and the reduced standards of living that brings. And you don't see the inequality created by the monetary easing. You don't see that, what is seen and what is unseen. And there's a very good wiki entry on Bastiat if you're interested. So you don't see, people don't understand the negative connotations of the new macro. So let's take a look at this unfunded liabilities versus the budget, what's on budget. So this is Truth in Accounting I pulled up on April 4, 2021. Here's the US published debt of $28 trillion, or about 90,000 per person. But the truth is that there's 140 trillion in unfunded liabilities. So each taxpayer's share is $900,000 of decreased standards of living over their lifetime due to the debt that's been accumulated by the debt. And the US published national debt consists of debt held by the public and intergovernmental holdings, but it does not include total unfunded Social Security and Medicare promises. So again, the unfunded liabilities or the unsustainable welfare state means that the real liabilities per person is almost $1 million, not just $90,000. So these, the Government Accountability Office has been reporting the unsustainability of the welfare state since as long as I've been studying this stuff, which is about 30 years. Yet politicians continue to run up the debt and print money, appoint central bank officials who have done easy money for the last 12 years. So why does this continue? Well, Sowell's rule, the first law of economics is that resources are scarce. The first law of politics is to ignore the first law of economics. So by using current expenditures and current easy money for current votes, transferring assets to special interests for votes, you then create economic or political groups which support you. And then those who are harmed by these actions don't see that harm, and they're unorganized. So the well-organized few benefit at the unorganized many, and that's Bastiat's what is seen and what is unseen. So you have the big buildup after the financial crisis, and then you have now the big stimulus during the COVID period. And the reason for that is politicians the state never lets a good crisis go to waste. And this idea, the state never lets a good crisis go to waste. This is from Robert Higgs, Crisis and Leviathan, Critical Episodes in the Growth of American Government, Robert Higgs on Oxford University Press, who looks at historical examples of crises and then how the state ratchets up. Right now, right, we have determination of essential services, and entertainment venues and restaurants are only 50%, open at 50%, and all these arbitrary rules by the state, as the state never lets a good crisis go to waste, bails out their cronies, and creates corporatism, allowing certain businesses to thrive while there's 10,000 restaurants in New York City which have permanently closed, and about 300,000 small businesses in the United States which have permanently closed. Or I guess about half of those will be permanent. So that Higgs calls that the ratchet effect. Once you have a state intervention during a crisis, well, some of those interventions will go away. Yes, eventually the economy will be open, hopefully. Wear a mask, stay home, wear 2 masks for the next year, whatever the CDC is going to proclaim, still playing out. So Higgs calls that the ratchet effect. Once the state uses a crisis to get power, that ratchets up the state's power and people's acceptance of state power. And so I guess the last thing I wanted to say, so these unfunded liabilities and debt levels are only at the federal level. Of course, states have huge unfunded liabilities. I believe the MTA in New York City and New Jersey has unfunded liabilities of about $45 billion. So one example I'd like to give of what is seen and unseen related to the new macro is what I like to call is the historian's favorite curve. So historian's favorite curve. A society starts out young and hungry, entrepreneurial, small state. Then as it grows, it expects more from the state. And then the state now overextends itself militarily, macro imprudence, and then overextends itself. And so you get the rise and decline of empire. You don't see this as the state becomes more and more unsound, but you have the rise and decline of empire as the state overextends itself. And this could be rise and decline of empire as the state overextends itself. And this could be Rome, this could be the Ottoman Empire, this could be the UK. And then we're asking, where is the United States here? under the new macro. Thank you. That completes our teaching module on changing views on sound macroeconomics.